The sun beat down on the cracked earth of the Manila prison camp, turning the ground to dust and the air to heat that pressed heavy against every breath as the women stood in a rigid line, their feet bare, and blistered their uniforms little more than rags that clung to gaunt bodies and hollow ribs. Yet none of them moved. None of them dared raise their heads because the sound of boots crunching on gravel was growing louder. With every step the guards were approaching, and there was something strange in the way they walked. Not with the usual cruel swagger or the careless dragging of rifles behind them, but with an uneasy rhythm, as if they too were uncertain of what they were being ordered to do, and the prisoners sensed this change. Though no words were spoken among them, only glances from the corners of their eyes that betrayed a flicker of confusion. And then the command came sharp and cold like the blade of a bayonet slicing through the haze. Bow. Lower the voice belonged. To the camp commander, a man known more for silence than speeches, a man who rarely addressed the prisoners directly. Yet now he stood before them clutching a single piece of paper in his hand, yellowed and creased at the edges as if it had traveled. Far before reaching his grip, his uniform was neater than usual, his posture rigid and formal, and behind him stood two American officers flanking him on either side, their expressions unreadable but clearly watching closely, and as the command echoed. Again, bow lower, the women obeyed as one, their bodies folding at the waist backs, aching from months of labor. But still they bowed deeper than they ever had before, their faces nearly brushing the dirt, and they stayed that way waiting for what would come next. The silence stretching out unbearably long until the sound of the paper unfolding broke it, and the commander began to read names in a language that twisted bitterly in the mouths of their enemies, names that had once held weight and honor in the empire, now dragged through the air of a foreign camp by a foreign tongue. Each name struck like a memory sharp and sudden. Some were names of officers they had served under, men who had commanded their units with the kind of loyalty that once felt unbreakable. Others were of soldiers who had fought beside them in the last chaotic days before capture, who had promised they would not fall into enemy hands. Yet here they were absent from this place, and apparently very much alive. The commander paused after each name, letting the air settle heavy between them before moving on, and though the prisoners kept their faces down, the names seemed to pierce the ground, rising like ghosts from the soil to whisper through their minds. And soon the whispers began to shift into something darker, rumors they had tried to bury, returning in full force, memories of whispered accusations that some officers had fled the battlefield, that some had surrendered long before the rest were captured, that others had bartered for survival in ways that left the rest to rot in the jungle. And now those very names were being read aloud by their American captors as heroes, as survivors, and each syllable dripped with implication, as if this roll call were not of honor, but of betrayal. The commander continued steadily, his voice never wavering. Though behind him the guards had begun to shift from foot to foot, some exchanging glances, while the Americans remained perfectly still, and the women began to feel a sickness rising in their chests, a slow, cold weight that crept into their lungs and settled there for the first time. They wondered if they were the forgotten ones, if they were meant to hear this because it was necessary or because it was cruel. And even as they kept their eyes down, they could sense the moment shifting into something irreversible, like watching a tide pull away from the shore, never to return. And then, without warning, the commander stopped reading. The list fluttered slightly in his hand as the breeze picked up, and one of the American officers stepped forward, giving a short nod, and from behind the prisoners came the grinding sound of tires rolling over gravel, the kind of sound that did not belong in the routine of the camp. And in that moment, every prisoner felt a strange electricity in their spine, a knowing that whatever was coming would not be forgotten. The truck rolled into view, its engine humming low and steady. Not a military vehicle, but a civilian one, clean, too clean. Its canvas cover tied down tightly. The guards made no move to stop it, and as it pulled up beside the commander, he motioned for it to halt, and the driver killed the engine, stepping down without looking. At the prisoners, instead, he moved to the back and began untying the canvas flaps, revealing not crates of food or supplies, but something far more unexpected. A tall man in a perfectly pressed uniform stepped down from the truck-polished boots, shining, gold insignia catching the sunlight, and as he turned to face the line of prisoners, every woman recognized him at once, Colonel Shiro Watanabe. Once a revered officer in the Imperial Army, once a man whose name had stirred pride in their ranks now. Standing tall beside the enemy, his face unreadable, but his posture confident, not bowed, not broken. And in that instant time seemed to hang still. As the colonel scanned the line of women, his eyes settling briefly on each one, before he stepped forward and began to speak, his voice calm, even gentle, though none of the prisoners could hear the words for what they were, their ears ringing with disbelief and anger and something deeper, something far colder. They had last seen him in the chaos of retreat. Near the Luzon Hills, when orders fell apart and men scattered in all directions, he had promised he would hold the line. He had promised he would not leave. And yet here he was, standing beside their captors, walking freely, his uniform untouched by the months of war and his hands unnervingly clean, and though none of them raised their heads, they felt his gaze crawling over them, measuring them, judging them, and the silence that followed his arrival was thick with questions none dared to ask, and then he smiled. The smile that crossed Colonel Watanabe's face was not the smile of reunion or of relief or even of apology, but the calm, confident smile of a man who believed he had already been forgiven, or worse, did not need to be forgiven at all, and as he stood before the line of prisoners still bowed low in the dirt, he began to speak, not in English, not in the stiff, foreign tongue of the Americans beside him, but in their own language, pure and formal and commanding, and that made it worse because his voice was familiar and steady. The same voice that had once called them to attention in parade drills, or addressed them during operations, or offered quiet words of encouragement before deployment. But now that voice told a different story. He said he had survived the war by aligning with shifting winds that he had assessed the moment before the surrender, and acted accordingly to preserve what could be preserved. He said there was no shame in choosing life over death when the war was lost, that duty must adapt to circumstance, and that he had used his rank to secure the release of those still imprisoned within this camp, and others like it scattered across the Philippine Islands, and though his words were calculated with care, they landed like stones in the silence, because none of the prisoners moved or responded or even breathed too deeply. For months they had endured heat and starvation. They had slept in cramped barracks filled with disease and despair. Their bodies, wasting their minds, unraveling piece by piece. Each woman had watched others wither and die, some from sickness, some from hunger, and some from despair, and the faces of those who had vanished haunted their every waking hour. Yet here was this man, polished and pristine, offering explanations as if they were all part of some greater strategy, one they had simply not been privileged to understand until now, and when he spoke of sacrifice, it was not with sorrow but with pride, as if they had all played a role in his plan. He motioned toward one of the American officers who stepped forward and opened a black case inside, where documents stamped with imperial seals and official insignia, and Watanabe said these papers granted them release, that they would be transported under protection to a neutral facility before being repatriated to Japan. But even this supposed gift carried a strange and bitter tone, because he spoke of their return not as a rescue, but as a negotiation completed, a debt settled through channels he had opened with the enemy. And that word enemy hung in the air like smoke, because in that moment it was no longer clear who it referred to as the colonel continued to speak. 2 guards approached from the side of the compound, wheeling a steel cart, its wheels squealing faintly against the stone path, and upon the cart were several crates battered and weathered, but bearing the faded red sun of their homeland. And when the first crate was opened, a wave of gasps rippled through the line even though no one looked up, because within the crate were personal belongings, sealed and protected, and eerily untouched. There were silk kimonos with embroidered family crests, letters written in delicate script. From mothers and fathers, siblings and husbands, small boxes containing photographs, medals, childhood dolls, and even jewelry that had been believed lost forever to looters and chaos. And somehow impossibly these things had been preserved, collected, and protected from the fires of war, and Watanabe said he had been the one to save them, that during the collapse of the front he had gathered what he could from abandoned bases and forward stations, knowing that identity would matter more than anything when the war was over. But the women did not feel gratitude. They felt the slow tightening of something unspoken, a coil winding itself deeper into their chests, because the items before them had not been taken by fate or chance. They had been taken by men who had fled, who had left them to face capture alone, and now stood here rewarded by survival, speaking of salvation in terms of strategy and trade. And they realized that what they were witnessing was not mercy, but theater carefully staged and performed for an audience they could not see, and still the colonel spoke. He said they would be leaving within days, that arrangements had been made, and that they would be honored as survivors upon their return. He spoke of new beginnings, of rebuilding the empire with the strength of those who had endured, and he said all of this with a calmness that turned every word into a blade. And then he bowed a slow, deliberate bow that made the guards shift uneasily again, and when he rose, he looked at each woman one more time as if expecting something, a response, a tear, a nod of acknowledgement, and still none came. Then the wind changed, just slightly carrying with it a sound that made every head twitch ever so slightly, not enough to draw attention, but just enough to feel the tremor of something wrong. It was not the sound of boots or metal or shouting, but something quieter, a kind of whimper muffled as if swallowed, and it came not from the line of women, but from the back of the truck still parked beside the platform, and Watanabe seemed not to hear it, or perhaps he chose to ignore it because he turned his back and began speaking with the American officers in low voices, gestures exchanged and papers signed as if their fates were no longer even worth discussing aloud. But the sound came again, this time louder, and it was unmistakably human. A sharp intake of breath. A single sob, and all eyes now subtly turned toward the truck, but the flaps remained closed tight as if whatever was inside was not meant to be seen, not yet. And before anyone could move, before the guards could step forward, one of the women in. The line broke formation. She did not stand or speak, but tilted her head just enough to catch a glimpse of what lay behind the canvas, and in that moment her body went rigid as if struck. Her mouth opened, but no sound came, and her hands clenched into fists so tight that her nails drew blood, and the colonel caught the shift in movement and turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, as if sensing that the illusion had cracked just slightly. And as he took a step forward, the woman looked up fully. For the first time in months, her eyes locking with his, and in them was no fear, only the terrible light of recognition. What she had seen behind that canvas was not supplies and not rescued comrades and not evidence of mercy, but something else. Something that would shatter every word the colonel had spoken, and as the tension thickened, the guards moved quickly, stepping between her and the truck. But it was too late, because now others were beginning to look up too, and the whispers had started again, and this time they would not be silenced. The guards flanked the line of prisoners, tightening their formation as though expecting some sudden move, yet even they seemed uneasy at what was unfolding. Colonel Watanabe remained at the center, his face rigid, his eyes flickering between authority and calculation, but something had changed in his stance, as if the ground beneath him trembled, though none could see it. The woman who had glimpsed the contents of the canvas had fallen back into line, though. Her hands still shook and her eyes burned with a recognition that refused to be hidden. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Even the wind hushed as if holding its breath. And then a guard shoved the canvas flap aside, angrily exposing the crate behind it, and the world contracted into that single reveal. Inside lay bodies draped in faded uniforms, bodies twisted and silent faces pale and hollow in the dim light, some partially covered by sheets torn and stained, an image of death, masked, as cargo, and the women gasped, though no sound escaped them because the horror was too sharp, too immediate. Their hearts hammered and their knees trembled as they stared at what they had been deceived about, what they had been invited to believe was mercy, but now revealed as a grotesque mockery. Colonel Watanabe stepped forward, his expression inscrutable, and he lifted his hand to motion for silence. The guards obeyed swiftly, forming a tighter ring around him, and the American officers froze, in place, as if they too were taken aback by what had been uncovered. The colonel's voice rose then, but not in anger, not in sorrow, but in controlled reproach. He said that these were the casualties of war losses that could not be prevented, that in the final days of retreat there were wounded soldiers left behind in field hospitals, overwhelmed, and that he had personally authorized the transport to preserve dignity and prevent desecration. He insisted that these bodies were under his care, that he had ensured their safe passage to this place, so that the families of the dead might claim them when the war ended. But his words rang hollow to ears that had heard too many lies. The women remained frozen in place, their minds racing, trying to reconcile the man they once trusted with this figure striding before them, as though guilt were a cloak he wore lightly. One of the prisoners stepped slightly forward, though she remained bent at the waist, her voice trembling though silent in the stillness, her eyes fixed on the corpses, and she reached out as if to touch one. But the guards blocked her instantly, pushing her backward and prodding her with rifle butts. The shock of contact, a reminder that they were still captives, still at the mercy of others, even as the colonel spoke of compassion and care. And when she recoiled, the silence swallowed her gesture as if it had never happened. But the moment had changed everything. The illusion had cracked, and inside every woman, a spark of defiance flickered, though none yet dared fan it into flame. The colonel continued speaking, his tone steady, his delivery practiced as though he had rehearsed this moment for days. He called these losses inevitable casualties of conflict, and said that death had not forgotten any side, that they were all victims of war, and that no further blame should be cast. He reminded that such wounds went beyond simple moral judgments, that in the collapse of supply lines and chaos, even the highest commanders were powerless to save every life. He looked once more to the American officers, who nodded in assent, though their faces betrayed discomfort, and their silence was heavy with unspoken questions. But the prisoners heard something else beneath his words, a current of evasion and rationalization, and they sensed that his narrative was designed to extinguish the outrage his presence had ignited. Before he could press further, the whispered wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound beyond the bodies. A soft groaning, a feeble moan that rose up from the crate like a plea for mercy, unreal and terrible. And the colonel froze for a heartbeat, as if the sound had taken him by surprise. Then he turned sharply toward the crate, and the guards surged forward to hold the canvas flaps tighter, though they had no concealment now. But the open crate was theirs to guard. Some of the women stifled reactions, their hands pressed over mouths. Others bent further down as if wanting to disappear into the dirt, but the one who had first seen it dared to remain upright, her eyes fixed on the crate, straining to hear the moan more clearly, and the colonel took a step toward her, his face hardening, and for an instant, every woman feared he would order his guards to kill her for daring to look. But then he stopped, his arm descending slowly, and he spoke to her softly, though all could hear. All he said was one word, though it carried the weight of command and threat and sorrow, rolled into one. He said silence, and with that the guard shoved the canvas flaps back to cover the crate, forcibly obscuring the sight, and the sound ceased abruptly as though strangled. The women exhaled a breath they did not even know they had been holding, and the colonel turned abruptly away, glancing toward the American officers, whom he beckoned with a nod. The officers stepped forward and ushered him aside into private discussion, their voices low, their gestures urgent, and though the prisoners could not hear the words, their body language spoke volumes as papers were shuffled, maps passed hand to hand, and fingers pointed at the line of women and at the crate, and at the looming shadows beyond the compound walls. Time stretched. Thin between heartbeats, the women bowed still with heads down, though their minds surged with questions, none of which had answers. The silence between them felt alive, charged with fear and outrage and longing and the suspense of what would come. Next pressed down on their chests until breathing felt like betrayal. The crate lay behind them, hidden again, though its dreadful secret now lived in every mind, in every tremor, in every reluctant heartbeat. Then one of the American officers stepped, toward the line, his uniform neat, his posture tight. He raised his hand to speak, and hesitated, as if measuring whether he should speak at all, and when he finally did, his voice was firm, though cautious. He said that orders had come from higher command, that the women were to be relocated under guard to a temporary holding facility that very evening, that until then they were to remain here, and that no one was to look behind the crate or disturb the transports beyond what had been authorized. A murmur of disbelief flickered among the prisoners, though no voice carried above a breath. The officer glanced at Colonel Watanabe, who nodded subtly, then turned to the guards, who began marshaling the women to move. The women stood and shifted awkwardly, their limbs stiff, their joints aching after months of immobility and burdened by the weight of what they had seen. The colonel raised his hand to signal the guards to begin their march. He took a step forward, addressing them again, but this time his tone was different, softer, as though trying to appeal to memory, to loyalty, to the bond they once shared. He said he understood their pain, their anger, their distrust, yet he begged them to hold on to patience and dignity, that whatever they believed now, he asked them to trust that he had plans beyond what they could see, plans for their safety and for their survival. As he spoke, the prisoners walked slowly past the open crate now. Curtained once more, the bodies buried in darkness again, as though they had never been revealed, though their presence lingered in the sharp taste of guilt and betrayal in every racing heartbeat. The colonel's words trailed behind them like a shadow following each step, and none of the women met his eyes, though many did glance furtively at his face, searching for cracks in his composure, for remorse, for weakness, but finding none. They reached the gate of the compound where trucks waited, engines idling their lights, casting long shapes across the dirt yard, and the guards ordered them to step forward into the backs of the vehicles. The women obeyed in single file, their feet dragging, their fingers brushing against the open doors, as if seeking some anchor in reality. And when at last each woman had climbed into the dim bed of a truck, she turned her head to glimpse the compound one last time, and in that glimpse she caught sight of Colonel Watanabe standing at the gate watching them board the transports, his figure rigid, his face inscrutable, and the crate behind him once more concealed behind canvas. The trucks began to roll forward, wheels grinding over gravel, and the women felt the ground shift beneath them, the world changing shape around them as they moved away from the place that had been their prison toward some unknown destination. The night air brushed their faces cold, though the day's heat still clung to their bones, and as the columns of trucks snaked through narrow roads, they passed through ruins of towns, bombed out hollowed shells of buildings, and the ghost of war looming in every shattered wall and broken window. Inside the trucks, the women sat huddled, shoulders touching knees pressed together, some closing their eyes to shut out the ruined world outside, some staring into the darkness ahead, wondering what awaited them. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, their hearts drumming a restless cadence, and none spoke, for though voices trembled, none dared break the silence. Their minds reeled with images of the bodies of their comrades, the lies that had brought them here, the promise of freedom offered and betrayed, and all the while the trucks rolled on deeper into territory they did not know. And then the convoy slowed as it approached a checkpoint lit by a single flickering lamp. The trucks halted, engines idling again, and the guards ordered the women out into a dusty clearing beneath the lamp. The women obeyed mechanically, stepping down into the light, their eyes blinking as they adjusted to the glare, and behind them the trucks stood dark hulks, waiting to move again. Any hope that this might be a minor stop evaporated in the way the guards herded them into tight formation. The officers emerged from shadows, and the colonel reappeared among them, stepping forward as though to address the prisoners. Yet the lamp between them cast deep shadows across his face, making him half hidden, half revealed. He spoke again, his voice carrying across the still night air, calm, confident, commanding, and he told them that they would be transferred to a secure holding zone just up ahead, that safety would be assured, and that any who resisted would be considered enemy collaborators, jeopardizing their own prospects. He said that they had been preserved thus far not by chance, but by plan and purpose, that the sacrifices made had meaning, that their identities would matter again, and that soon they would know the full scope of what had been arranged for them. But as his words drifted across the clearing, a cold wind rose from beyond the broken buildings. The lamp flickered, and for a fleeting moment, his shadow stretched monstrous across the dust. The women felt their knees weaken, their spines coil tight, fear burning in their bones. One of them glanced behind the colonel toward the trucks, and in that instant the canvas flaps of one vehicle rustled slightly, as though caught in a wind. Though no wind blew, the woman's heart clenched. She tried to point, though her arm would not obey, and before she could speak, a rifle butt crashed into her shoulder, forcing her gaze back forward. The colonel's eyes flicked toward the sound and held there for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether to react. And then he spoke again, gesturing toward the line to move forward, and as the women were forced to step ahead, he paused, then turned his head slightly toward the truck behind him, and his lips moved, though no one heard words. So they walked onward, hearts pounding, shadows lengthening behind them, and each step took them farther from what they had known toward something waiting in darkness. And as the first woman crossed the threshold of the secure zone, gate clasped between two ruined pillars, the lamps flickered once more and died, plunging them all into a darkness deep and suffocating. And there in the void they stood waiting for what would come next, their breaths shallow and their bodies trembling. And unseen behind them a sound began anew, a soft moan from the crates, still riding inside the trucks, a plea half swallowed by night that echoed in the silent air, and in that darkness every woman felt her own fear swell into certainty that they had not been saved but marched into a deeper trap. The darkness that swallowed them after the lamps died was not like nightfall. It was heavier, thicker, full of weight and memory. It pressed against their skin and filled their lungs like ash. And yet, the women continued to move forward, as ordered, their steps small and uncertain, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Now the only sound in the void, the guards said nothing. They prodded them with rifle barrels or shouted short commands, but even their voices sounded quieter, as though muffled by the blackness around them, and above them the stars had vanished behind a sky smothered in cloud. The path curved between two jagged stone walls, the remnants of a structure that must have once stood, proud before the bombs tore it down, and as they entered the ruins the women felt the air grow colder, the wind more erratic, as if the very place rejected their presence. The guards lit a single lantern, its flame barely more than a flicker, but it cast dancing shadows on the shattered concrete around them. And as the group moved deeper into the crumbling shell of the building, their hearts beat faster, their minds racing with questions they dared not speak. What was this place? Why bring them? Here, what was the purpose behind the theatrics of rescue, the speeches, the staged crates, and now the silent march into a ruin that smelled of mold and rust and something else, something more ancient, more human, that clung to the walls like breathless echoes? Some of the women exchanged glances, others kept their eyes on the floor, too afraid to let fear show. But it was in all of them, pulsing behind every heartbeat and hiding beneath every breath, the fear that this was not a transfer, that this was not salvation, but a beginning of something much worse. They reached a courtyard at the center of the ruins, where several more lanterns had been hung from iron hooks, casting circles of light that did little to warm the space around them. In the center was a stone platform covered in moss, and behind it a large wooden door reinforced with thick rusted bands and no visible handle. The colonel appeared from the shadows, his posture as precise as ever, and his boots clean despite the muck and gravel. And he stood before the platform and began to speak again, his voice quiet, but carrying across the courtyard with unnatural clarity. He said that they were standing upon sacred ground, once used for oaths and judgment, during a time when war was still waged by swords and honor, not rifles and fire. He said the building had been part of an old Spanish mission later claimed by the Americans, and now repurposed by those who understood that the past was not something to bury, but something to wield. He spoke of legacy and consequence of cycles that demanded to be completed, and how the suffering of one generation became the foundation of the next. And as he spoke, the women listened, not because they trusted him, but because the gravity of his tone dragged at their attention like a riptide. He turned toward the strange door and gestured, and two guards stepped forward and pulled it open with a screech of rusted hinges. The door led not to a room, but to a stairwell descending into darkness. And without being told, the prisoners knew this was where they were being taken, one by one or all together. It did not matter, because the path was already chosen, and resistance had been drained from them long before the door had opened. One of the women whispered a prayer beneath her breath. Another reached for the hand of the woman beside her, and the guards began to move forward, selecting the first group with casual authority. The first 5 were taken toward the stairs with rifles, pressed to their backs, and before they could react, they were swallowed by the dark passage, the echoes of their footsteps fading quickly, and then the colonel looked at the remaining women and said simply, "They will return when they are ready." And no one asked what that meant, because the look in his eyes was enough to silence any thought of protest. It was not cruelty in his expression, nor kindness. It was something far worse, something unfeeling, a look that belonged not to a man, but to a role he had embraced fully. More groups were selected and disappeared into the stairwell until only 10 remained, huddled beneath the dim lanterns, clutching what little they had left in the world. And then a sudden cry came from below. Not a scream, but a single shouted word in Japanese, sharp and panicked, and immediately followed by silence, and the colonel turned his head slightly as though disappointed, then turned to the guards and gave a new order, this time in a voice loud enough for all to hear. "Take the rest together." The 10 women were pushed toward the stairs, their feet stumbling as they were driven forward, and the stairwell engulfed them in moments, the light from the courtyard vanishing behind them. As they descended deeper into the earth, the air turned damp and heavy, and the walls wept with moisture and old paint peeling from stone, and still they moved downward, the guards behind them silent. The only sounds were their own breathing and the echo of boots on concrete, and the deeper they went, the more their sense of time unraveled, until it felt as though they had always been descending and would never rise again. Finally, they reached the bottom, A vast open chamber dimly lit by a single row of lights hanging from exposed wires running along the ceiling, and in the center of the room stood a circle marked in red paint, or perhaps blood, impossible to say. And surrounding it were chairs and benches arranged like a tribunal, and in those chairs sat others. Not soldiers, not prisoners, but civilians of various ages, all Japanese, all silent and all watching as the women were herded into the circle and ordered to kneel. Colonel Watanabe stepped into the light behind them, now dressed not in his military uniform, but in ceremonial robes, black with red trim, and a sash bearing the imperial crest. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed no longer. A commander, no longer a negotiator, but something more ancient, he said. They were here to bear witness and to choose that they had been spared not out of mercy, but because they carried within them the final link to a legacy that must either end with their silence or be reborn through their decision. He pointed to the far wall where a large cloth was drawn aside, revealing a mural painted across the stone in deep crimson hues. The image showed a battlefield littered with bodies, a rising sun dimmed by ash, and a circle of women. Standing untouched at its center, their faces blank, their hands raised, and from their mouths fire erupted. Not flames of destruction, but fire as knowledge as judgment, as something older than war and older than empire, and the colonel said, this was a vision that had come during the final days of the war, to those who had understood that history was not merely written, but spoken, passed from voice to voice, until it either died or changed. And so he gave them a choice. He said, speak and become. Part of the new story, or remain silent and be sealed with the old. Their testimonies would be recorded not for court, not for politics, but for something far more lasting. Their words would shape what the world remembered and what the next generation believed, and he knelt beside them, placing a recording device in the center of the circle, then stepped back and waited the chamber so quiet that the hum of the lights sounded like a storm. The women looked at one another, unsure what to say, if anything, unsure whether this was truth or madness, unsure if anything they said would matter. But one of them, the same who had first seen behind the canvas and heard the moans, stepped forward, not speaking, yet just rising slowly and looking at the mural, then at the colonel, then at the recorder, and when she finally opened her mouth to speak, the words came not as history, but as memory, raw and broken and unstoppable. She spoke of hunger, of humiliation, of comrades who died nameless, and how those in power used silence as a shield. As her voice echoed off the chamber walls, the other women followed one by one, adding their pieces not in perfect order or complete truth, but in fragments full of pain and fury and longing, and the colonel listened. Without interruption, his face unreadable. The civilians in the tribunal nodded solemnly as if receiving something sacred, and the lights above flickered once more. And just as the last woman finished speaking, the stairwell behind them roared with a sudden rush of air as if the earth itself had breathed for the first time in decades, and a low rumble began from somewhere deep below, and the colonel turned toward the sound and said quietly, "It has begun." And no one knew if he meant the end, or something else entirely. The sound that came from beneath the chamber was not like thunder and not like machinery. It was older, deeper, something primal that shook dust from the ceiling and sent tremors through the stone floor, and the women felt it rise through their knees into their chests and hearts, as if the very earth was listening to what they had spoken, and now responded with its own voice. The colonel turned slowly, his ceremonial robes fluttering in the growing draft, and his eyes searched the shadows beyond the stairwell as though waiting for someone or something to appear, and still he said nothing. The women stood now no longer kneeling, their eyes wide and uncertain, their breaths short as the tribunal began to move. The silent figures who had been seated behind them stood one by one and descended from their benches, each carrying a strip of cloth red and marked with a single black character, and as they approached the women, they offered the cloths without words, without instruction, and somehow every woman knew exactly what to do. They took the cloths and tied them around their arms like bands of witness, not of allegiance and not of submission, but something older than both. The colonel stepped into the center of the chamber, now standing where the recorder had been, his voice clear and calm, though the rumble beneath them continued. He said the stories had been heard, the silence broken, and that the old war had ended in fire. But the truth had been buried beneath the ashes, and now the truth had voice again, and though no nation had claimed them and no flag had flown for them, they had become the fire that would burn the lies from history, and what would rise from it would be neither victory nor defeat. But remembrance, a wind surged through the stairwell behind them, unnatural and strong enough to send the lantern swinging wildly, and as the shadows danced across the chamber, the walls seemed to pulse with something unseen and alive. And then a new sound joined the rumble, a metallic grind followed by a long groan of stone against stone. And the colonel turned again, this time with urgency. In his movements, he beckoned the women toward a far wall where another hidden door now slowly opened, revealing not a corridor, but the outside world. Cold air rushed in, and with it the scent of pine and wet soil and something cleaner than anything they had breathed in months. The women moved as if drawn toward it, their eyes blinking in disbelief. And as they crossed the threshold, they found themselves not in the ruined courtyard above, but on the slope of a forested hill, far from the camp, far from the crates, far from the ghosts of what they had endured. The path before them was narrow and lined with torches already lit, though no hands had struck their flames, and the colonel emerged behind them, stepping out into the fresh night, his robes billowing in the mountain air. He said the path was theirs now, and where it led depended not on orders or commanders or even nations, but on their own steps, and what they carried with them. He said no guard would follow. No soldier would chase, but the world they returned to would not be the same as the one they left, because they were no longer simply prisoners. They were witnesses. They were carriers of a truth more powerful than command or country, and that truth had its own weight and its own price. The women walked then slowly, at first unsure of what to believe, unsure if the promise of freedom was another illusion. But each step took them farther from the ruins, from the lies, from the endless hunger and pain. And slowly, one by one, they began to feel something strange, something unfamiliar. They felt lightness, not joy, not yet, but a loosening of the chain around their chests. And in that loosening was the first breath of something like hope. They reached a bend in the path and turned. And when they looked back, the stone door had closed, the chamber gone, the torches now. Behind them and in its place, only trees and wind and the distant call of birds, as if morning was near. Though the sky was still deep with stars, they did not speak. They did not need to, because each of them knew that the silence had ended, and that what they carried in their memories and on the red bands around their arms would speak louder than any flag ever could. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, casting a golden glow on the horizon, one of the women reached into the folds of her uniform and pulled out a scrap of paper, a letter she had hidden all this time, unread and unopened, and she finally looked at it with trembling hands. The ink faded, the words blurred by moisture, but the signature at the bottom was clear. It was her mother's name written in careful strokes before the war, before the silence, and she held it to her chest and closed her eyes and whispered something only she could hear. And behind her the other women paused, letting the light fall across their faces, and in that moment none of them were soldiers or prisoners or ghosts. They were what remained. They were what refused to disappear. They were what rose from the ashes when the world looked away and when they turned again to continue. Walking, they did not look back because the past had already heard them, and now it was the future that waited ahead. Far below, in the ruins, the wind settled. The lanterns flickered once more, and then died. and in the darkness of that silent chamber, the recording device blinked once, then stopped, and the last sound it had captured was not the voice of the colonel or the orders of the guards, but the sound of a woman laughing soft and broken.